Sarah Martinez adjusted her worn baseball cap as she walked across the military academy grounds. The morning sun cast long shadows between the imposing brick buildings, and the sound of marching cadets echoed from the nearby parade field. At 32, she looked younger than her years, her compact frame moving with a quiet confidence that most people missed entirely. She had driven 3 hours to reach the prestigious Riverside Military Academy, not as a visiting dignitary or guest speaker, but as a newly hired maintenance supervisor. After 8 years in the Navy, including 5 as a SEAL, Sarah had chosen a path that surprised everyone who knew her. Instead of leveraging her elite military background for a high-paying contractor job or corporate position, she wanted something simpler, quieter. The Academy's facilities manager, Colonel Reynolds, had hired her over the phone after a brief interview. Her resume listed Navy veteran and maintenance experience, but she had deliberately kept the details vague. She wasn't hiding her service record, but she had learned that mentioning her SEAL background often created unnecessary complications. People either treated her like a curiosity or questioned whether a woman could have really earned the trident. As Sarah made her way toward the maintenance building, she noticed a group of senior cadets near the obstacle course. They were supposed to be in morning classes, but instead they were horsing around, their voices carrying across the quad with the particular brand of arrogance that came from believing the rules didn't apply to them. She had seen the type before, young men from wealthy families, who viewed their time at the academy as an extended summer camp rather than serious military preparation. The maintenance building was older than the rest of the campus, its gray concrete walls showing decades of wear. Inside, she found her new workspace, a cluttered office filled with work orders, supply catalogs, and maintenance schedules. The previous supervisor had left behind a mess of incomplete projects and deferred repairs. Sarah rolled up her sleeves and began sorting through the chaos, her methodical approach honed by years of military precision. Around noon, she headed outside to inspect the academy's infrastructure. The obstacle course needed attention, several wooden barriers were rotting, and the rope climb station had frayed lines that posed a safety hazard. She was taking notes when she heard raised voices from the direction of the cadet dormitories. 3 senior cadets were confronting a younger student near the building's entrance. Even from a distance, Sarah could see the tension in their body language. The younger cadet, a slight boy who couldn't have been more than 16, was backed against the wall while the older students crowded around him. Their voices were getting louder, and Sarah caught fragments of their conversation, something about money, about knowing his place, about consequences. Sarah had seen enough bullying in her military career to recognize it instantly. The dynamic was always the same, those with power using it to intimidate those without. She had experienced it herself during her early days in the Navy, when some male sailors had decided that a woman didn't belong in their ranks. But she had also learned how to handle it. She walked toward the group with measured steps, her clipboard in hand and her expression neutral. The cadets were so focused on their target that they didn't notice her approach until she was just a few feet away. "Excuse me," she said calmly, her voice carrying just enough authority to cut through their conversation. "Is there a problem here?" The 3 older cadets turned toward her, and Sarah immediately read their expressions. The leader, a tall young man with perfectly pressed uniform and cold blue eyes, looked her up and down with barely concealed disdain. His name tag read Morrison. Behind him, 2 slightly smaller cadets flanked him like bodyguards, their faces wearing identical smirks. "No problem here," Morrison said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Just having a conversation with our friend about academy traditions. Nothing that concerns the cleaning lady." The younger cadet, still pressed against the wall, shot Sarah a grateful but worried look. She could see the fear in his eyes, the same expression she had seen on the faces of civilians in war zones who had learned that safety was never guaranteed. Sarah kept her voice level and professional. "I'm not cleaning staff. I'm the new maintenance supervisor, and academy traditions shouldn't involve intimidation." Morrison's expression shifted to amusement, and he exchanged glances with his companions. "Maintenance supervisor," he repeated mockingly. "Well, supervisor, why don't you supervise yourself back to whatever closet you crawled out of? This is cadet business." The dismissal was meant to be final, but Sarah didn't move. She had faced down enemy combatants in hostile territory and survived firefights that would have broken most people. A spoiled teenager with delusions of authority didn't even register on her threat assessment scale. The Academy's code of conduct applies to all cadets, she said quietly. I suggest you remember that. Morrison stepped closer, using his height advantage to try to intimidate her. Listen, lady, I don't know who you think you are, but you're nobody here. My father sits on the Academy's board of directors. I could have you fired before lunch. Sarah recognized the type immediately, the kind of person who had never faced real consequences, who believed that connections and money could solve any problem. She had encountered similar attitudes among certain officers who had never seen combat but expected instant respect based on their rank alone. Your father's position doesn't give you the right to bully other students, Sarah replied evenly. The other two cadets moved to flank her, creating a triangle formation that was clearly meant to be threatening. Morrison's face flushed red with anger at her continued defiance. You know what? He said, his voice rising. I think you need to learn some respect. Morrison grabbed Sarah's shoulder and shoved her backward, expecting her to stumble or fall. What he didn't expect was for her to absorb the impact with practiced ease, her center of gravity remaining perfectly balanced. Years of hand-to-hand combat training had taught her how to read an opponent's intentions before they even moved. That was a mistake, Sarah said quietly, but Morrison was too angry to listen. He rushed forward, intending to knock her down and teach her a lesson about challenging his authority. His two companions moved in from the sides, clearly planning to overwhelm her with numbers. It was a tactic that might have worked against an ordinary person, but Sarah Martinez was far from ordinary. The first cadet reached her a split second before Morrison. Sarah sidestepped his clumsy grab and used his momentum against him, redirecting his forward motion with a simple hip toss that sent him sprawling onto the grass. The movement was so fluid and effortless that it looked almost choreographed. Morrison, seeing his friend go down, swung a wild haymaker at Sarah's head. She ducked under the punch and swept his legs, dropping him hard onto his back. The impact knocked the wind out of him and he lay gasping on the ground, his perfect uniform now grass-stained and disheveled. The third cadet, realizing that things weren't going according to plan, tried to tackle Sarah from behind. She heard his footsteps and spun around, catching him mid-charge with a textbook defensive maneuver that redirected his momentum and sent him tumbling into a nearby hedge. The entire encounter had lasted less than 30 seconds. 3 senior cadets, all bigger and younger than Sarah, now lay scattered around the quad like discarded toys. She hadn't even broken a sweat. The younger cadet who had been their original target stared in amazement, his mouth hanging open. A few other students had emerged from the dormitory, drawn by the commotion, and they stood frozen in shock at what they had witnessed. Morrison struggled to his feet, his face red with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. His carefully cultivated image of dominance had been shattered in front of witnesses, and he couldn't process what had just happened. You can't do that, he sputtered, grass sticking to his uniform. You assaulted cadets. I'll have you arrested. Sarah remained calm, her breathing steady and controlled. I defended myself after you initiated physical contact. There are witnesses. She gestured toward the growing crowd of cadets who had gathered to watch the spectacle. Several of them were holding phones, and Sarah realized that the entire incident had probably been recorded. In the age of social media, Morrison's humiliation would likely be broadcast across the academy within hours. Besides, Sarah continued, Academy security cameras cover this entire area. I'm sure they captured everything, including who threw the first punch. Morrison's 2 companions had picked themselves up and were brushing dirt from their uniforms. They looked embarrassed and confused, clearly not understanding how a middle-aged woman had so easily outmatched them. Their military training at the academy was supposed to make them formidable, but it was largely ceremonial compared to real combat experience. Colonel Reynolds appeared at the edge of the crowd, drawn by reports of a disturbance. He was a career Army officer who had served multiple combat tours before taking his position at the academy. As he surveyed the scene, 3 disheveled cadets, a calm maintenance supervisor, and a crowd of excited witnesses, his experienced eye quickly assessed what had transpired. What's going on here? He demanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. Morrison immediately launched into his version of events, painting himself as the victim of an unprovoked attack by an unstable employee. His story was elaborate and indignant, full of legal threats and references to his father's influence. Sarah waited patiently for him to finish, then simply said, "Colonel, I'd recommend reviewing the security footage. It will show exactly what happened." Reynolds studied her carefully. During their phone interview, something about Sarah's voice had suggested more depth than her resume revealed. Now, seeing her composed demeanor in the aftermath of what was clearly a physical altercation, he began to suspect there was more to his new maintenance supervisor than met the eye. "Cadet Morrison," Reynolds said firmly, "you and your friends report to my office immediately. We'll review the footage together." Morrison's confidence wavered as he realized that his version of events might not hold up under scrutiny. "Sir, I demand that this woman be dismissed immediately. She's dangerous." "The only thing I'll be dismissing is your story if it doesn't match the video evidence," Reynolds replied coldly. "Move." As the three cadets reluctantly headed toward the administration building, the crowd of witnesses began to disperse. Several younger cadets approached Sarah with expressions of awe and gratitude. The boy who had been their original target, a thin freshman named Danny, walked up to her with tears in his eyes. "Thank you," he said quietly. "They've been picking on me for weeks." Nobody ever stood up to them before. Sarah felt a familiar weight in her chest. She had joined the military to protect people who couldn't protect themselves, and leaving that mission behind had been harder than she expected. Seeing the relief in Danny's face reminded her why she had originally chosen to serve. "Just remember," she told him, "bullies usually back down when someone stands up to them. You're stronger than you think." As the crowd cleared, Sarah found herself alone with her thoughts. She had hoped to keep a low profile at the academy, to blend into the background and do her job without drawing attention. But some situations demanded action, regardless of the consequences. 20 minutes later, Sarah was back in her office reviewing maintenance schedules when Colonel Reynolds knocked on her door. His expression was unreadable as he entered and took a seat across from her desk. "I've reviewed the security footage," he said without preamble. "All of it, including the angle that shows you could have seriously injured those boys but chose not to." Sarah set down her paperwork and met his gaze. She had expected this conversation, though she wasn't sure which direction it would take. "The way you moved," Reynolds continued, "the precision of your defensive techniques, the complete situational awareness, that's not something you learn in weekend self-defense classes. That's military training, advanced military training." Sarah remained silent, knowing that anything she said could complicate her situation further. Reynolds leaned forward in his chair. "I've been in the Army for 23 years. I've seen every type of soldier, from weekend warriors to special operations veterans. What I saw in that footage was someone with serious combat experience." He pulled out his phone and showed Sarah a web page. It was her official Navy service record, the classified portions redacted but enough visible to tell the story she had tried to keep quiet. "Sarah Martinez, Petty Officer First Class Navy SEALs," he read aloud. "Multiple deployments to Afghanistan and Iraq. Purple Heart Bronze Star with V Device for Valor Navy Cross." He looked up from the phone. "You want to explain why someone with your background is working as a maintenance supervisor?" Sarah sighed, knowing her cover was blown. "I wanted a quiet job where I could help people without anyone asking questions about my past." "Why hide it?" "Your record is extraordinary." "Because," Sarah said, choosing her words carefully, "people react strangely when they find out. Either they treat me like some kind of celebrity, or they spend all their time trying to prove I couldn't have really done those things. I just wanted to be normal for a while." Reynolds nodded slowly, understanding evident in his expression. "Combat veterans often struggle with readjusting to civilian life, but hiding your skills isn't the answer." "I wasn't hiding them," Sarah replied. "I was just hoping not to need them." Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion in the hallway. Through the office window, Sarah could see a group of senior cadets gathering near the entrance to the building. Word had clearly spread about the morning's incident, and emotions were running high. Reynolds stood and looked out the window. "Morrison's friends are rallying support. They're claiming you're dangerous and demanding your removal." Sarah felt a familiar tension building in her shoulders. She had faced this type of situation before, when her presence in male-dominated units had been challenged. The dynamics were always the same, a test of will disguised as a matter of principle. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we find out what kind of academy we really run here," Reynolds replied grimly. "Morrison's father called the superintendent 20 minutes ago, demanding your immediate dismissal. He's threatening to withdraw his substantial donations if action isn't taken. Through the window, Sarah could see the crowd of cadets growing larger. Some appeared to be supporters of Morrison, their faces angry and confrontational, but she also noticed a smaller group standing apart, younger cadets who looked worried rather than angry. Danny was among them, along with several other students who appeared to be frequent targets of bullying. "There's something else you should know," Reynolds said. "Morrison and his friends aren't just bullies. They're part of an unofficial group that's been making life miserable for younger cadets for years. Hazing, extortion, intimidation. We've had complaints, but never enough evidence to take action." Sarah understood immediately, because the victims are too scared to speak up officially. Exactly. And the perpetrators all come from influential families. It's been an ongoing problem that the administration has struggled to address. The situation was becoming clearer to Sarah. Her intervention hadn't just stopped one incident of bullying. It had challenged an entire power structure that had existed at the academy for years. Morrison and his allies weren't just angry about being embarrassed. They were fighting to maintain their position of dominance. Reynolds's radio crackled to life. "Colonel, we need you at the main entrance. There's a situation developing." Sarah followed Reynolds outside, where they found nearly 50 cadets gathered in an increasingly tense standoff. Morrison stood at the center of one group, his uniform now cleaned and pressed, but his face still showing the bruises from his encounter with the ground. He was speaking animatedly to his supporters, gesturing toward the maintenance building. "She attacked 3 cadets without provocation," Morrison was saying, his voice carrying across the quad. "This woman is dangerous and unstable. She has no business being on this campus." But Sarah noticed that his narrative was being challenged by some of the witnesses. Several cadets were showing their phones to others, apparently sharing videos of the actual incident. She could see doubt creeping into the faces of some of Morrison's supporters as they watched the footage. Danny stepped forward from the smaller group, his voice shaking but determined. "That's not what happened. She was defending herself after you attacked her, and she was protecting me from you and your friends." Morrison's face flushed red. "Stay out of this, rat. You'll regret opening your mouth." The threat was made in front of dozens of witnesses, including Colonel Reynolds. Sarah saw the colonel's expression harden as he realized the extent of the intimidation that had been taking place under his nose. "Cadet Morrison," Reynolds called out sharply. That sounded very much like a threat against a fellow cadet. The crowd fell silent as the colonel stepped into the center of the group. His presence commanded immediate attention, and Sarah could see the military bearing that had carried him through decades of service. "I've reviewed the security footage of this morning's incident," Reynolds announced. "What I saw was 3 senior cadets initiating physical contact with a staff member, who then defended herself with minimal necessary force. I also heard clear evidence of the bullying and intimidation that led to the confrontation." Morrison tried to interrupt, but Reynolds silenced him with a look. "Furthermore," the colonel continued, "I've just witnessed additional threatening behavior toward a younger cadet. This pattern of conduct is unacceptable and will not be tolerated." Sarah could see the dynamics shifting as Reynolds spoke. Some of Morrison's supporters began to distance themselves, realizing that their position was becoming untenable. The younger cadets, meanwhile, seemed to be finding their courage as authority finally acknowledged what they had been experiencing. The tension in the quad was broken by the arrival of Superintendent General Patricia Hawkins, a formidable woman in her 50s, who had risen through the ranks to become one of the highest-ranking female officers in the Army. She approached the gathering with the measured pace of someone accustomed to diffusing volatile situations. "Colonel Reynolds," she said calmly, "I understand we have a situation that requires my attention." Reynolds quickly briefed her on the morning's events, including Morrison's father's phone call and the subsequent gathering of cadets. General Hawkins listened without interruption, her sharp eyes taking in the faces of everyone present. Morrison, emboldened by the arrival of higher authority, stepped forward. "General Hawkins, my father spoke with you about this dangerous woman who attacked me and my friends. We demand justice." The general studied Morrison for a long moment before responding. "Cadet Morrison, your father did indeed call me. He was quite passionate in his description of events. However, I prefer to base my decisions on facts rather than emotions." She gestured toward Sarah. "Ms. Martinez, would you join us, please?" Sarah approached the group. aware that dozens of eyes were tracking her every movement. She had been in similar situations before, standing before superior officers while her actions were scrutinized and judged. "I understand you were involved in a physical altercation with 3 of our cadets," General Hawkins said. "Yes, ma'am. I defended myself after Cadet Morrison initiated physical contact." "And your background?" "Colonel Reynolds mentioned you have military experience." Sarah hesitated for a moment, then decided that honesty was her only option. "I served 8 years in the Navy, ma'am. 5 of those with naval special warfare." A murmur ran through the crowd of cadets. Most of them knew enough about military structure to understand what naval special warfare meant. And the revelation that their maintenance supervisor was a former SEAL sent shockwaves through the group. Morrison's face paled as he realized the implications. "That's impossible," he sputtered. "Women can't be SEALs." General Hawkins turned to face him with an expression that could have frozen water. "Cadet Morrison, you seem to be operating under some outdated assumptions. Women have been serving in special operations roles for years, and some of the most effective warriors I've known have been female." She turned back to Sarah. "What rating did you hold, Ms. Martinez?"
"Special warfare operator, ma'am."
SO1. The general nodded approvingly. "And your deployments?" "4 combat deployments, ma'am. Afghanistan and Iraq." Morrison looked like he was going to be sick. The woman he had dismissed as nobody, the person he had thought he could intimidate and physically assault, was a decorated combat veteran with more real military experience than anyone at the academy. General Hawkins addressed the assembled cadets. "Let me share something with all of you. Ms. Martinez has more actual military experience than most of you will ever have. She has served in combat zones where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. She has protected American interests in some of the most dangerous places on Earth." She paused, letting her words sink in. "And this morning she showed remarkable restraint by using minimal force to defend herself against 3 attackers. A less disciplined person might have seriously injured or killed you." Danny found his voice again, emboldened by the general's words. "Ma'am, Morrison and his friends have been bullying younger cadets for months. They take our money, destroy our property, and threaten us if we complain." Other younger cadets began to speak up, their voices overlapping as months of suppressed frustration poured out. Stories of extortion, physical intimidation, and psychological abuse painted a picture of systematic harassment that had been allowed to fester unchecked. Morrison tried to deny the accusations, but his protests were drowned out by the testimonies of his victims. Several cadets produced their phones, showing text messages with threats and videos of previous incidents. General Hawkins listened to each account with growing anger. As the stories unfolded, it became clear that the morning's incident was just the latest manifestation of a much larger problem. "Cadet Morrison," she said finally, her voice cold with controlled fury, "you and your associates report to my office immediately. You're suspended pending a full investigation." Morrison's arrogance finally cracked. "You can't do this. My father will have your job." "Your father," General Hawkins replied evenly, "is welcome to take up his concerns with the Secretary of the Army. I'm sure she'll be very interested to hear about the culture of abuse that's been allowed to flourish under his son's leadership." As Morrison and his friends were escorted away by military police, the crowd of cadets began to disperse, but many of the younger students remained, surrounding Sarah with expressions of gratitude and amazement. "I can't believe you're a SEAL," Danny said, his voice filled with awe. "That's the most awesome thing ever." Sarah smiled, feeling some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "It's just a job," she said modestly. "The important thing is that you all found your voices today." General Hawkins approached as the last of the cadets headed back to their dormitories. "Ms. Martinez, I owe you an apology. If we had been doing our job properly, you never would have been put in that situation." "No apology necessary, ma'am. I'm just glad it's resolved." "Actually, it's not resolved yet," the general said. "We need to talk about your future here at the academy." Sarah felt her heart sink. Despite the vindication, she wondered if her position was still secure. The incident had drawn too much attention, created too much controversy. "If you're firing me, I understand," she said quietly. General Hawkins looked surprised. "Fire you? Ms. Martinez, I'm about to offer you a promotion." Sarah stared at General Hawkins in disbelief. "A promotion, ma'am?" "Walk with me." the general said, leading Sarah away from the quad toward her office. What happened today exposed serious flaws in our system. We've been so focused on academic and ceremonial training that we've lost sight of what real military values look like. They entered the administration building, passing portraits of distinguished graduates and display cases filled with academy memorabilia. General Hawkins's office was spartanly decorated, with only her military awards and a few family photos providing personal touches. "Sit down," the general said, gesturing to a chair across from her desk. "I need to be honest with you about something. The bullying problem here isn't new, and it isn't isolated to Morrison's group. We've been struggling with it for years." Sarah listened as General Hawkins explained the challenges facing modern military academies. Many students came from privileged backgrounds with no real understanding of military culture or values. They saw their time at the academy as a networking opportunity, rather than preparation for service. "We've tried traditional disciplinary measures," the general continued, "but they don't address the root of the problem. These students don't respect authority because they've never faced real consequences for their actions." "What kind of promotion are you talking about?" Sarah asked. "Assistant Commandant of Cadets," General Hawkins replied. "You'd be responsible for discipline, training, and character development. Basically, you'd help us turn these privileged teenagers into actual soldiers." Sarah was quiet for a moment, processing the offer. It was far beyond anything she had expected when she took the maintenance job. "Ma'am, I don't have any experience in education or administration, but you have something more valuable: credibility. After today, every cadet in this academy knows that you're the real deal. They can't dismiss you or intimidate you. Some will respect you, others will fear you, but none of them will ignore you." The general pulled out a tablet and showed Sarah a series of news articles that had already appeared online. Word of the incident had spread beyond the academy, with social media posts and news reports describing the confrontation between cadets and a Navy SEAL veteran. "Whether you like it or not, you're already famous," General Hawkins said. "We can either let this story spin out of control, or we can use it as an opportunity to make real changes." Sarah scrolled through the articles, noting how the narrative was already being shaped by different perspectives. Some portrayed her as a hero standing up to bullies, while others questioned whether she had used excessive force against students. "There's something else," the general added. "Morrison's father has hired a law firm to pursue criminal charges against you. He's claiming assault and battery." Sarah wasn't surprised. Wealthy families often tried to use legal pressure when they couldn't get their way through normal channels. "What's the academy's position?" "We're standing behind you completely. The security footage clearly shows self-defense. But it's going to be a fight, and it's going to be public." General Hawkins leaned forward in her chair. "That's why I need someone with your background in this position. We're going to face scrutiny from parents, media, and politicians. I need someone who won't back down when the pressure gets intense." Sarah thought about the offer. The maintenance job had been appealing because it was simple and quiet, but she realized that she had been hiding from her true calling. The look of relief on Danny's face when she had intervened reminded her why she had joined the military in the first place. "What would my actual responsibilities be?" she asked. General Hawkins smiled, recognizing that Sarah was seriously considering the offer. "You'd oversee the disciplinary system, design and implement new training programs, and serve as a mentor for cadets who are struggling. Think of it as turning this place into a real military academy, instead of an expensive summer camp." They were interrupted by a knock on the door. Colonel Reynolds entered with a grim expression on his face. "General, we have a problem," he said. "Morrison's father has arrived with a team of lawyers and what appears to be a private investigator. They're demanding access to personnel files and security footage." General Hawkins stood up. "Let them demand. They'll get what the law requires and nothing more." She turned to Sarah. "This is what I was talking about. Are you ready for this kind of fight?" Sarah had faced enemy fire, improvised explosive devices, and hostile interrogations. A team of lawyers seemed almost quaint by comparison. "Yes, ma'am. I'm ready." "Good. Colonel Reynolds, please prepare the paperwork for Ms. Martinez's new position. I want her officially appointed before Morrison's father can cause any more trouble." As Reynolds left to handle the administrative details, General Hawkins turned back to Sarah. "There's one more thing you should know. This morning's incident was caught on camera by multiple cadets, and the videos are already going viral on social media. You're about to become a very public figure. Sarah pulled out her phone and checked the major social media platforms. Sure enough, videos of the confrontation were spreading rapidly, with thousands of comments and shares. The hashtag #Our Navy SEAL Mom was trending, along with Yarn Military Academy and Bully Justice. The response is interesting, General Hawkins observed, reading over Sarah's shoulder. Most people are supporting you, but there's also a significant backlash from those who think you used excessive force against students. Sarah read through some of the comments, noting the polarized reactions. Veterans and military families were overwhelmingly supportive, praising her restraint and professionalism. But others questioned whether a grown woman should have physically engaged with teenagers, regardless of the circumstances. This is going to get worse before it gets better, General Hawkins warned. Are you sure you're prepared for that level of attention? Sarah thought about the question seriously. Fame had never been something she wanted or sought. But she also remembered the faces of the younger cadets who had been bullied and intimidated for months without anyone willing to help them. Ma'am, I didn't serve overseas to come home and watch kids get terrorized by bullies. If taking this position means I can prevent that, then the media attention is just something I'll have to deal with. General Hawkins nodded approvingly. That's exactly the attitude we need. Welcome to your new job, Assistant Commandant Martinez. 3 days later, Sarah found herself sitting in a television studio preparing for her first major media interview. The story had exploded across national news, with everyone wanting to hear from the Navy SEAL who had taken down 3 military academy cadets. She wore her dress uniform, the ribbons on her chest telling the story of her service more eloquently than words ever could. The interviewer, a polished journalist named Rebecca Chen, had done her homework. Ms. Martinez, or should I say Assistant Commandant Martinez, you've become something of an internet sensation. How do you respond to critics who say you used excessive force against teenagers? Sarah had practiced her answer, but she spoke from the heart. I used the minimum force necessary to defend myself after being attacked. My training taught me to neutralize threats while minimizing harm, which is exactly what I did. But these were students, not enemy combatants, Chen pressed. That's true, and it's why they're alive and uninjured instead of in the hospital, Sarah replied calmly. If I had wanted to hurt them, the outcome would have been very different. The interview continued for 20 minutes, covering Sarah's military background, the incident at the academy, and her new role as assistant commandant. Throughout, she maintained the composed professionalism that had served her well in combat zones. When the camera stopped rolling, Chen approached her personally. Off the record, I think you handled that situation perfectly. My own daughter dealt with bullying at school, and I wish she'd had someone like you in her corner. Sarah thanked her and left the studio, knowing that the interview would be broadcast that evening to millions of viewers. The Academy's public relations department had coached her on staying on message, but she had ultimately decided to simply tell the truth. Back at the Academy, the atmosphere had changed dramatically. Morrison and his 2 associates had been expelled after the investigation revealed the extent of their bullying activities. Video evidence and testimony from dozens of cadets painted a picture of systematic abuse that could no longer be ignored. Sarah's new office was in the main administration building, with a view of the parade ground where cadets conducted their daily drills. She had spent the last 3 days meeting with faculty, reviewing disciplinary records, and beginning to understand the scope of the problems she was tasked with solving. Colonel Reynolds knocked and entered, carrying a thick folder of documents. The good news is that Morrison's father dropped the assault charges. His lawyers apparently advised him that the case was unwinnable given the video evidence. And the bad news? Sarah asked. He's now threatening to sue the Academy for creating an unsafe environment for his son. Claims we should have known you were dangerous when we hired you. Sarah almost laughed at the irony. So we're dangerous for hiring someone qualified to handle dangerous situations? Logic isn't his strong suit, Reynolds replied. But General Hawkins isn't worried. The Academy's legal team is confident in our position. Reynolds set the folder on Sarah's desk. These are the preliminary reports from our investigation into the bullying incidents. What we found is disturbing. Sarah opened the folder and began reading. The documented cases of harassment, extortion, and intimidation went back over 2 years. Morrison's group had operated with virtual impunity, protected by their family's wealth and influence. How many cadets were affected? Sarah asked, flipping through page after page of incident reports. At least 40 that we can document, probably twice that many who never reported anything. Reynolds replied grimly. Some of these kids were paying protection money just to avoid being beaten up. Sarah felt her anger rising as she read the details. One cadet had been forced to do homework for older students under threat of having his belongings destroyed. Another had been locked in a storage closet overnight as punishment for refusing to participate in hazing rituals. Where was the oversight? She asked. How did this go on for so long without intervention? Reynolds looked uncomfortable. The truth is, some faculty members knew what was happening but felt powerless to stop it. Morrison's father was a major donor, and complaints against his son had a way of disappearing. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Danny, the freshman who had been Morrison's target during the original incident, stood nervously in the doorway. Ma'am, you said I could come talk to you if I had any problems, he said quietly. Of course. Danny, come in. Sarah gestured to a chair, noting how the boy's confidence had grown over the past few days. It's not a problem exactly, Danny said. It's more like other cadets are asking me to thank you. A lot of us want you to know how much it means that someone finally stood up to Morrison. Sarah smiled at the earnest young man. You stood up to him too, Danny. That took real courage. Only after you showed me it was possible, he replied. But there's something else. Some of the older cadets, Morrison's friends who didn't get expelled, they're saying you won't last, that their families will find a way to get rid of you. Reynolds and Sarah exchanged glances. They had expected retaliation from the affected families, but hearing it confirmed by the cadets themselves was concerning. Danny, I want you to listen to me, Sarah said seriously. If anyone threatens you or tries to intimidate you because you spoke up, you report it immediately. That behavior is not going to be tolerated anymore. After Danny left, Sarah turned to Reynolds. How many of Morrison's associates are still here? About a dozen senior cadets who were part of his inner circle. We couldn't expel them all without concrete evidence of wrongdoing, but we're watching them closely. Sarah stood and walked to her window, looking out at the cadets conducting afternoon drills on the parade ground. She could see the rigid formations and precise movements that were the hallmark of military training. But she also knew that real discipline came from within, not from external compliance. We need to change the entire culture here, she said finally. It's not enough to remove the worst offenders. We need to create an environment where this kind of behavior can't take root in the first place. What do you have in mind? Reynolds asked. Sarah turned back to her desk and pulled out a notepad. First, we implement a zero-tolerance policy for hazing and bullying. Not just punishment after the fact, but prevention through education and mentorship. She began writing as she spoke. Second, we establish a confidential reporting system that bypasses the normal chain of command. Too many victims stayed silent because they feared retaliation. Reynolds nodded approvingly. Those are good starts. What else? Leadership training, Sarah continued. Real leadership, not the superficial version they've been teaching. These cadets need to understand that true strength comes from protecting others, not dominating them. As she outlined her plans, Sarah felt a sense of purpose that she hadn't experienced since leaving the Navy. This was different from maintaining buildings or fixing equipment. This was about shaping young minds and building character. Her computer chimed with an email notification. The message was from General Hawkins, forwarding a news article about the Academy's response to the bullying scandal. The headline read, Military Academy appoints Navy SEAL as reform leader. The article was generally positive, highlighting Sarah's qualifications and the Academy's commitment to change. But the comments section revealed the deep divisions the incident had created. Veterans and military families praised the appointment, while some parents questioned whether a violent person should be working with children. The spotlight's not going away anytime soon, Reynolds observed, reading over her shoulder. Sarah closed the laptop and looked at her reflection in the dark screen. The woman staring back at her was someone she was still getting used to, a public figure whose every action would be scrutinized and debated. That's fine, she said finally. If being in the spotlight means we can prevent other kids from going through what Danny experienced, then it's worth it. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. You think you've won, but this isn't over. Some of us have long memories. Sarah showed the message to Reynolds, who immediately called Academy Security. We'll trace this and add it to the investigation file, he assured her. But Sarah wasn't worried about anonymous threats. She had faced much worse from people far more dangerous than disgruntled teenagers and their wealthy parents. What concerned her more was the responsibility she now carried, the trust that dozens of young cadets had placed in her to create a safer environment. As evening approached, Sarah prepared to leave her office. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more media attention, and continued resistance from those who benefited from the old system. But tonight she could go home knowing that cadets like Danny would sleep peacefully, free from the fear that had dominated their lives for so long. 6 months later, Sarah stood before a packed auditorium at the National Military Academy Conference, addressing hundreds of educators, military officers, and policymakers. The transformation at Riverside Academy had become a case study in institutional reform, drawing attention from military installations around the world. When I first arrived at the academy, Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly through the microphone, I thought I was taking a simple maintenance job. I never imagined I'd become the face of a movement to reform military education. The audience laughed appreciatively, but Sarah's expression remained serious as she continued. What we discovered at Riverside wasn't unique. Bullying, hazing, and abuse of power exist in military institutions across the country because we've confused authority with leadership, compliance with character. Behind her, a presentation screen showed statistics from the Academy's transformation. Reported incidents of bullying had dropped by 80%. Academic performance had improved across all grade levels, and cadet satisfaction surveys showed dramatic increases in morale and confidence. The key wasn't harsher punishments or stricter rules, Sarah explained. It was creating a culture where standing up for others was valued more than maintaining silence, where protecting the vulnerable was seen as strength rather than weakness. In the audience, Sarah spotted familiar faces. General Hawkins sat in the front row, beaming with pride at what they had accomplished together. Colonel Reynolds was there too, along with several faculty members who had supported the reforms from the beginning. But the face that made Sarah smile most was Danny's. Now a confident sophomore, he had become a leader among his classmates and a mentor to incoming freshmen. He represented everything they had worked to achieve. Young people who understood that true military values meant service to others. After her presentation, Sarah was surrounded by attendees asking questions about implementation strategies and potential challenges. Military educators from other institutions wanted to adapt her programs to their own schools, while policymakers discussed the broader implications for military culture. During a break, Danny approached her with several other cadets who had made the trip to the conference. Ma'am, we wanted you to know that the academy feels completely different now. New students actually want to come there because they've heard it's a place where everyone is respected. That's not my achievement, Sarah replied. That's what happens when good people decide to stand up for what's right. You all made that choice. One of the other cadets, a young woman named Jennifer, spoke up. My older sister went to Riverside 5 years ago and dropped out because of the hazing. When I told her I was enrolling, she tried to talk me out of it. Now she's thinking about applying for graduate programs there. The changes at Riverside had indeed been remarkable. The zero-tolerance policy for bullying had been enforced consistently, regardless of family connections or donations. The confidential reporting system had given victims a safe way to seek help, while the leadership training programs had taught cadets that true strength came from lifting others up rather than tearing them down. But perhaps most importantly, the academy had attracted new faculty and staff who shared the reformed vision. Veterans from all branches of service had applied to work at an institution that prioritized character development over political connections. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. But this time it wasn't a threat. Ms. Martinez, you don't know me, but my daughter is a freshman at Riverside. She calls home every week to tell us how much she loves it there. Thank you for making it safe for kids like her. Messages like that had become common as word spread about the academy's transformation. Parents who had previously avoided military schools were now considering them as options for their children, while military families felt confident that their sons and daughters would be treated with dignity and respect. During the final panel discussion, a journalist asked Sarah about her future plans. Will you be staying at Riverside or do you have other ambitions? Sarah considered the question carefully. My goal was never to become famous or build a career in education. It was to create an environment where young people could develop into the kind of leaders our military, and our country need. She paused, looking out at the audience filled with people who shared that mission. As long as there are students who need someone to stand up for them, I'll be there, whether that's at Riverside or anywhere else that values courage over compliance. The conference concluded with a standing ovation, but Sarah's mind was already turning to the challenges ahead. Reform was an ongoing process, not a destination, and there would always be those who preferred the old ways of doing things. Back at the academy the following week, Sarah found a note on her desk from a new freshman cadet. "Dear Assistant Commandant Martinez," it read, "my older brother told me that you're the reason Riverside changed from a place where kids got picked on to a place where everyone looks out for each other. I wanted you to know that kids like me notice, and we're grateful." Sarah folded the note and put it in her desk drawer alongside dozens of similar messages. Each one reminded her why she had chosen to leave the quiet life of a maintenance supervisor and take on the challenges of institutional reform. The academy grounds looked the same as they had on her first day: imposing brick buildings, perfectly manicured lawns, and the sound of marching cadets echoing across the quad. But the atmosphere was fundamentally different. Where once there had been an undercurrent of fear and intimidation, now there was genuine camaraderie and mutual respect. That evening, Sarah attended the weekly Leadership Council meeting where senior cadets discussed issues affecting the student body. She listened as they debated policies, resolved conflicts, and planned community service projects. The conversations were thoughtful and respectful, a far cry from the toxic dynamics that had once dominated cadet interactions. As the meeting concluded, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. She had never intended to become a public figure or a symbol of institutional reform. All she had wanted was to stop 3 bullies from intimidating a scared freshman. But sometimes the most important battles choose us, rather than the other way around. And sometimes standing up for one person can change an entire institution, inspire a movement, and prove that individual courage really can make a difference in the world. The maintenance supervisor who had wanted to remain invisible had become a leader whose influence extended far beyond the academy walls. It wasn't the quiet life she had planned, but it was the life that had chosen her, and she had never been more proud of the work she was doing.